Where would you say that CRT fits into the equation? Because that seems to be a point of contention for a lot of parents. It seems to be a point within the education system that has become very political. Maybe just opening up dialogue to you to kind of get a sense of like, maybe not necessarily your stance on that, but how can we approach that conversation?
Well, yeah, I think critical race theory, it's so funny. I was reading a lot about critical race theory a few years ago, and I was writing a book proposal at the time, and I remember the publisher said, well, all this critical race theory stuff, I don't think anyone's going to be interested in it. And then cut to a few years later, it's all anyone can talk about.
So they missed the mark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, like I said, the problem is there are ideological teachers coming out of hyper left-wing colleges where they've been taught that whiteness is bad, whiteness is evil, white supremacy culture pervades society. All of the typical American principles like freedom of speech, free markets, meritocracy, objectivity, these are all products of white supremacy. And when you go in to teach, you have to ditch all of them. There are people being taught this stuff. It's pretty fringe. A lot of your listeners may just like never have heard of it in their own lives. But if you go to like Columbia Teachers College or really many teachers colleges, you're going to be taught this stuff. And this stuff comes straight out of critical race theory. It's basically the thesis of critical race theory. And then certain teachers feel that they should inflect that into the way that they teach in the classroom. Now, are they teaching actual critical race theory tests? Are they texts? Are they whipping out Kimberly Crenshaw's, academic papers from the 80s? No. But I think that's an unconvincing critique of that there's a problem. There's a problem, which is that teachers are diluting that into digestible lessons for kids. And what do you do about that as a parent? I would not want my kid, who is, very likely going to be black or of color in some capacity, and I don't want them going to school and being made to think about their race and the race of their classmates at a young age, because I grew up in a very racially diverse environment, and as a half black, half Puerto Rican kid, I had black friends, white friends, Jewish friends, Hispanic friends, etc. I never thought of their race. And I think that racial innocence is important to protect, because kids are not naturally racist until they get exposed to the toxic adult world of racism. I think it's very important to protect that racial innocence in the same way that we protect kids' sexual innocence. And so there is a kind of teacher coming out of these activist spaces that wants to inject the activism into the classroom. And so how do you fight that? Well, one way to fight that is to create laws saying you cannot teach kids anything that makes them feel guilty because of their race or so forth. Now it's like that's very dangerous, because a lot of things might make a kid feel guilty because of their race. And I use this example because these laws have actually been passed. And then you have teachers saying, okay, you're censoring my ideas. You're censoring, like, how do I even teach history without possibly making anyone feel bad? Sometimes learning history makes you feel bad, right? And then and then that's overly broad. So how do we address this problem without trying to write ideas out of the classroom? It's a difficult, almost impossible thing to do. So it's a tough question.
Can we go down this pathway a little further? Because I think this is fascinating, and it's interesting to get your take. I mean, I thought about, like, my son is 1/3 Lebanese, but he's got blonde hair, green eyes. It doesn't look like he's Lebanese at all. And it's an interesting conundrum to think about, him going into school and learning about dividing himself. And then he's like 20, I mean, not 20, but like a dozen other ethnicities, right? Mm-hmm. And it is interesting to thinking about him going into school and sort of subdividing his identity based on his background and race and ethnicity. So you were sort of saying that there's a thesis around CRT. What would you say that thesis is?
The thesis of CRT is that all of the principles we think of as race neutral, like meritocracy, like markets, like freedom of speech, like the rule of law, these are not neutral, but they are actually white supremacy in disguise. So there's no such thing as race neutrality. There's no such thing as a race neutral set of rules by which our society, can live by. So we must reject all of those things which appear to be race neutral. We must reject rule of law, free speech, markets, etc., and essentially substitute, as Black people, we must substitute like our own set of particular unique values and simply take political power to the extent that we can. That's the thesis of critical race theory in a nutshell.
Interesting. Okay.
Whereas the thesis of the civil rights movement was more or less to affirm all of those principles. Yes, rule of law is good. Yes, free speech. Yes, democracy, etc. But Black people have been excluded from them. So include us. Include us in the good, fundamentally good system of American democracy. That was the thesis of the civil rights movement. The thesis of CRT, which came after that, was actually no. The civil rights movement's diagnosis was importantly wrong. All those principles are actually bad. They're white supremacist principles by nature. So we need to dismantle them and substitute a kind of Black version, which will be based on different principles.
Can you steelman the perspective? Because this is we're just going to play with this for a second and see where it takes us. Can you steelman the perspective that something like free speech or freedom of speech is inherently racist or white supremacist?
So if I were to argue that, I would just point to the fact that racists today are protected by free speech laws, right? Like if you want to be a Richard Spencer or, a David Duke and say what you want to say about Black people and so forth, what's protecting your right to say those things is freedom of speech. Otherwise, we would be able, and I would say, what I would say if I was someone who agreed with this take, which I don't, is that speech hurts Black people. It hurts people of color. And freedom of speech allows racists to continue harming people of color with their speech. And that's what free speech is all about. That's what they think.
I was going to ask on an arbitrary scale, but how important would you say that freedom of speech and free speech actually is in America?
I think it's the backbone of what makes America great. Look, the civil rights movement would not have happened in a country without free speech, right? It's not an accident that America had a civil rights movement. What protected people like Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and so forth is that our First Amendment says the government cannot imprison them for what they're saying, right? Absent that, their message was very divisive at that time, and they had lots of enemies, right? If you lived in a country where you could just imprison and exile inconvenient people, then it would just be like Tiananmen Square in China, right? Like the civil rights movement would have been Tiananmen Square, and we'd never have heard about it again. Or
James
Russia,
Baldwin
right?
James Baldwin would have been gone.
Would have been done. Ida B. Wells, the most important anti-lynching activist in American history, her newspaper she called the Memphis Free Speech. I don't think that that's an accident. I think it's because free speech was the only principle protecting someone like her to the extent that it did. And again, it has not operated perfectly, but can you imagine how much worse it would have been if we didn't have a free speech principle for civil rights activists, for socialists and communists in the 40s and 50s, for any dissidents of any kind, for Vietnam dissidents? I mean, in some way, you simply have to ask the question, what would American history have looked like for minorities, for people of color, for women, etc., if we had no First Amendment? And the question just answers itself. So to ditch the principle now because some of those battles have been won is extraordinarily short-sighted. We have no idea how things will evolve in the next 50 to 100 years. And to say, well, free speech has been good when it protected us, and now that it's protecting alt-right assholes, let's just get rid of it. That's exactly the wrong position, because it fails to account for, just from a self-interested point of view, it fails to account for how deeply things can change and always do change.
I mean, I'm loving talking to you, so this is great. I just had like 18 different questions sprout out as you were talking. What would you say that the notion that freedom of speech is inherently racist or is sort of steeped in white supremacy, like what are the roots of that? Where does that come from? Are there certain people that have been espousing that idea and sort of pushing that and bringing that into fringe culture and the mainstream culture? Like what's that rooted in?
So basically, I think there's a term for this that I'm now forgetting, but free speech is always under attack. It's been under attack throughout all of American history. At any point in time, you can find people saying, actually, we should shut those voices down. And the people saying that are always the people who have cultural power, right? The people who have cultural power in any given moment, they always want to silence their critics. It's like a human nature tendency in every society on earth. The concept of letting other people speak and letting everyone have an opinion, that's pretty actually rare. More common is to say they're the enemy, we have more power, let's freaking kill them or throw them in prison. So essentially, the people that have cultural power always want to get rid of free speech. McCarthyists essentially wanted to get rid of free speech because of the threat of communism. The slaveholders wanted to get rid of free speech for abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass because, they were threatened. Who has cultural power today? In some way, you can always see who has cultural power by who is trying to get rid of free speech, right? Because they're assuming getting rid of it will benefit them. They're assuming they won't be thrown in prison or canceled or have their lives destroyed. So the people calling to get rid of free speech are quite often, almost always, the ones with the cultural power who would benefit from such a change. And in the year, 2023, that happens to be, because of recent changes in American history and culture, that happens to predominantly be people with liberal views on issues like race and gender, right? Like, for example, to give one example, I may get the facts slightly wrong here, but Abigail Shrier, who wrote a book critical of trans activist ideology. I think the marketing campaign on Amazon, it was suspended. Like, her book was suspended for a little while, and I think it may also have been taken off of the Target website, right? And it's not a bigotry screed it's a journalistic account of how certain young teen girls are suffering from rapid onset gender dysphoria and quickly moving into medical transitions that they potentially later regret.
And it's like happening within groups, right? Like, she specifically does research around how it's like happening in clusters, essentially, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Which you would not expect if it was, which suggests a social contagion element. Anyway, that's her thesis. Agree with it or don't. That's her thesis. Generally, you're allowed to write a book with a thesis about society, and it doesn't get like taken off major booksellers, even if it's like crazy, right? There are thousands of crazy, horrible, vicious arguments in books. They never get taken down. On the other hand, if you were a like a very left-wing pro-trans activist, there's no book you could write crazy enough to get it removed from the Target website at this moment. It wouldn't happen. So what does that say about cultural power at this moment? I'm not talking about political power. I'm not talking about who has money or who is in the halls of Congress. Those are different questions, important questions, but different one. I'm talking about who has sort of power at a lot of elite American institutions, corporate institutions. Right now, that power skews a bit to the left. And so it's no accident that you see mostly people on the left attacking free speech.
That's a very interesting way to put it. And I appreciate that, because I think that pieces some things together for me that I've wondered about.